Every day, in every type of occupation, people find themselves in situations potentially dangerous to their health.
Whether you work in an office, on a production line, or in several diverse work situations, it is vitally important to your safety that you are aware of and assess the risks associated with your working environment. Now, there are hazards that are immediately obvious, and there are hazards that may not be so obvious. Whatever the case, hazardous work situations can result in injury or illness and should be avoided. And that's what risk assessment is all about. Carrying out a risk assessment program is smart thinking. Instead of waiting for an accident to occur, doesn't it make sense to take steps to avoid or minimise the likely consequences of any unsafe situation or event? In simple language, it's about thinking ahead and asking, what if? The first step in the risk assessment process is the identification of hazards. Hazards and how to identify them. Put bluntly, a hazard is a situation or event that could result in injury or illness. Now, some hazards you probably see every day. So often, in fact, that you are used to the risk and don't even regard it as a hazard. Let me give you an example. Imagine that a cleaner leaves a bin beside your work area every day. Now, you know the bin is there, so you step over it or around it automatically. Unfortunately, the new apprentice doesn't. Recognising that a situation is potentially a hazard is the first step in eliminating or controlling that hazard. Having identified a hazard or potential hazard, the next step in dealing with it is to categorise it. Categorising hazards. Unsafe machinery, an object blocking a pathway, even an open filing cabinet can be classified as mechanical hazards. Spillage from hot liquids, offcuts or metal filings, poorly designed equipment, all are examples of physical hazards. Chemical hazards can include direct contact with chemicals, vapours in the atmosphere from paints or solvents, even airborne particles can constitute a chemical hazard. The need to undertake excessive workloads, inadequate recognition of the work performed, or insufficient variety and repetitive work are defined as psychological hazards. Once a hazard is identified and categorised, your next task is to predict the type of injury or illness it could cause. It doesn't take an Einstein to predict that strained muscles or another back or musculature injury is likely to be caused through heavy manual lifting. Here's another easy prediction. Objects blocking walkways or spilt liquids that haven't been cleaned up create the perfect situation for a nasty fall. Incorrectly stored or identified chemicals. You know what's in that unmarked black container, but does anyone else?
Hey, you want to watch this stuff, mate? They reckon it's bloody dangerous.
Come on, mate, give us a break, will you? What are you, my guardian angel or
Charlie,
something?
just a friendly warning.
Okay, well, do me a favour, will you? Get off me back.
Look,
go and annoy someone else, will
I'm
you?
off your bloody back, but just be careful.
Listen, buzz off, will you? Hurry!
Charlie, for God's sake! Come on, mate, up here!
Okay, let's just stop for a minute and assess. We have identified the hazard, and then we categorised the hazard, and then we predicted the injury or illness likely to be caused by exposure to the hazard. Now we need to assess the frequency of and the level of exposure to the hazard. How often are you and your workmates going to be within the area of the hazard? A machine operator in daily contact with a poorly maintained or protected machine would be a high frequency of exposure. A secretary who might walk past the same machine once a week would face a much lower frequency of exposure. When we evaluate the risk a hazard presents, We don't just look at it as if no one else ever realised the potential hazard. We need to recognise and take into account the effectiveness of any risk control measures already in operation. You can see here that the operator is wearing appropriate safety clothing, while the machine itself is fitted with appropriate safety guards. In assessing the risks associated with this particular machine, you may come to the conclusion that existing safeguards eliminate the identified hazard. There are many examples of risk control measures already in operation. One of the most obvious is the use of mechanical tools to minimise physical handling of heavy goods. Effective risk assessment involves the successful collaboration between management and employees. Now, this can often be achieved by a working committee consisting of senior management representatives and health and safety representatives or personnel. Assessing risk. You are not alone. You're worried about your ability to estimate the risk presented by a hazard? Well, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. You can reference data from Comcare Australia, WorkSafe Australia, journals, and other appropriate government bodies. These organisations can provide you with comprehensive information that will indicate the likelihood of injury or illness occurring from exposure to any hazards in your workplace. Finally, when assessing a risk, you need to determine who may be affected by exposure to the risk. As with the example of our machinist and secretary, the frequency and duration of exposure to a hazard should be estimated or measured.
Who is at risk? Frequency of exposure to risk, duration of exposure to risk. Information, training and supervision will help to ensure that you work in a safe environment. Safety training programs should provide an understanding of health and safety legal responsibilities, the nature of hazards in the workplace, the processes of hazard identification, risk assessment and risk control, arrangements for reporting circumstances likely to cause hazards, reasons for and safe use of risk control measures being in place in the workplace, and finally, safe work practices.
Okay, we have identified a hazard and the risk or risks have been assessed and the likely injury or illness predicted. Now we have to work out how you intend to control the risk.
Controlling risk. Legislation requires that where a situation has been assessed as posing an increased risk, then that risk must be controlled as far as practicable.
As far as practicable? What exactly does that mean? Well, what it doesn't necessarily mean is shutting down the machine or ceasing activity. It does require us to take a number of issues into consideration. The severity of the hazard or risk under review, the state of knowledge about the hazard or risk, and the ways of removing or minimising it, the availability and suitability of ways to remove or lessen the hazard or risk, and the cost of removing or minimising the hazard. The prioritisation of risk control measures is 1. To eliminate the risk. In the case of a spillage, this can be as simple as wiping up the offending spill. 2. To substitute the hazard with something posing a lesser risk, using correct and clearly marked storage facilities for chemicals, for example. 3. Engineering control. For example, using a mechanical aid to alleviate heavy lifting. 4. Administrative control. Implementing safer work procedures or training staff in safe operating techniques would be a good example of this. 5. Using personal protective equipment, such as safety glasses and gloves. It's important that all risk assessment and risk control procedures are documented. Once introduced, the procedures need to be checked to ensure they do in fact reduce the previously assessed risk. This checkup may even involve repeating the entire process of hazard identification, risk assessment and risk control to ensure that all risks to health and safety from the particular hazard have been controlled as far as practicable. If this subsequent review reveals some remaining risk, the process should continue until the risk has been minimised as far as practicable. Remember, managing hazards is an ongoing process, constantly evolving as technology changes and further risk control options become available. Let's just recap on what we've learned so far. Thinking ahead and asking, what if? Identifying potential hazards, categorizing hazards, predicting the likely injury or illness, assessing the frequency of and level of exposure to any hazards, and recognizing and taking into account the effectiveness of any risk control measures already in operation, and finally, controlling the risk. A safe workplace helps morale and productivity, and we all know that people are the most valuable resource of any enterprise. It makes sense then to keep them healthy and provide an environment where they can use their skills to the best of their abilities. Thanks for watching, and remember, be careful out there.